I'm Cliff Ribner, and I want to talk to you today about one of the real abominations of the progressive era, the income tax. I've talked about it before. I've been a tax lawyer my whole career, since 1979. I actually have an advanced law degree in tax law from NYU Law School. And the income tax has a history, and the history ain't pretty. Everybody has gotten used to having a huge chunk of their income taken out every time you get paid. I'm going to tell you about that and where that came from and how that happened to get there and just how hideous it is in the context of our actual legal system. First of all, Louis XIV created an income tax in France. There wasn't any other income tax in either France or England at the time. He did it by waving a hand. And the way he did, because he was the king. And in France, he was an absolute ruler. France was a very stratified society, and the stratification was legal. It actually affected the rights that people had. For example, there were nobles, and there were peasants, and then there was the clergy. And the peasants originally they were basically serfs. Serfdom had essentially ended by, say, the 18th century, 17th century, but there were still attributes of it. There were still humiliating things that the peasants had to put up with. One of which was taxation, not the income tax. They didn't even have the income tax, but they had all kinds of other taxes. And the peasants were the only ones who had to pay them. One of the attributes of being a noble in pre-revolutionary France was you were exempt from taxation. And so when Louis XIV imposed this 10% income tax, it was on a population of people that were already really impoverished. None of the rich people paid it. So he didn't have to say, oh, we're only going to tax the rich, as he did just the opposite. But he didn't have to make excuses, because he was an absolute monarch. And that's what happens when you have a government that has absolutely no checks and balances over it with respect to certain people. And that's what our government has been trying to do to us. Anyway, he did that at that time, and it was just another tax burden, basically, on the peasants who were already very poor. Now, he was relatively popular. The guy was a great PR man. He kept France basically broke the whole time he was monarch. And when he died, one of his descendants, Louis XV, was the one, because Louis XIV lived a very long time for that time. And when he died, his successor to the throne, because it was a monarchy where it was by male succession, and the successor was Louis XV, who was a child at the time. And at that time, there was a regency for Louis XV. And the regent was dealing with this broke country. It was broke because a lot of the taxes didn't really go to the king. The way they collected taxes, there was no IRS in France. What they did was they were called the farmers general. They were not involved in tilling the land. What they did is they basically went out and took taxes from people, and they got to keep a piece of the action. It was a very lucrative job within the old regime. And that's how the king collected his taxes. And there were all sorts of things. One of them that they really hated, there was one tax that used to make the peasants, it was a special tax. It didn't involve money. They had to go work on roads for various periods of time. This was the most despised tax. It was basically slavery for 2 weeks or more when they had to do this. They had to leave the land that they were farming, because they were basically farmers. That's what they did. That's what the peasants were in pre-revolutionary France. It was basically an agricultural economy, and Louis XIV had ambitions of strengthening it. He thought he could do it by his own power. He could delegate, or he could create industries that would be successful. And when it came to rewarding artisans and playwrights, he was very adept at that, but he wasn't very good at real economics. It wasn't him he had people working for him who were the geniuses doing this. And of course, they had a colonial empire, which included what is now half the a third of the United States, called the Louisiana Territory. Jefferson eventually bought it when we became a republic. He bought it in 1806. And that was a great thing for America. It was when Napoleon was really desperate for cash, and we got it for $15 million, which was worth a lot more in those days, but it was still not much for that. I mean, we're talking numerous states in the United States. Of course, there weren't any real cities there, other than New Orleans. The New Orleans was there, and I think St. Louis was there also. But anyway, that's how Louis XIV was able to create an income tax. And the British did not have an income tax at all until during the Napoleonic Wars. they imposed one briefly, so that when we fought the British, there was no income tax. And it was recognized as being a particularly despicable tax because enforcing it required forcing people to turn over their income, forcing people to show all sorts of things about themselves that people just don't want to show. So it was that aspect of it that was so hideous, kind of like when they made the peasants work just for the government, just, as peasants, having to do road building work and stuff like that. And it was something, of course, nobles were exempt from that in France. In fact, the real reason the French Revolution started was when Louis XVI was king. He had a guy named Necker, Jacques Necker, who was actually a Genevan Calvinist. And this is in a France that was very Catholic. In fact, there was a time when Louis XIV made it basically criminal to be anything but a Catholic. He literally sent Protestants to work on they were called the galleys. They were these ships where they died in 2 years when they were put on these things. It was a death sentence. It was just really hideous. Anyway, Louis XVI, France was bankrupt. It had been bankrupt the whole century. Oh, I was going to tell you about the Banque Générale that happened during the regency of Louis XV. John Law was a Scotsman who talked Louis XV's regent into creating a bank that was secured by the Louisiana Territory, which I was just talking about. That was the ultimate security. Basically, they created a stock company so that there was stock underlying it, so that in theory there was a tradable asset underlying the money that was created. And initially, this was a way to create money for the king, who was always broke. They were also involved in all sorts of wars, especially Louis XIV was involved in all sorts of wars. At the time that this was being done, France was really, the monarchy, although it looked rich, they built Versailles, and they funded all sorts of great artists and playwrights, people whose names are not common in America today, but they would be very well known among literary scholars. Moliere, anyway, they were great writers, wonderful stuff, beautiful paintings, and the king lavished all sorts of stuff on them. And when Louis XIV built Versailles, the whole purpose of that was basically to hold the nobility captive. It was a gilded cage where he wanted all the nobles in France to be there, so that he would have them literally under his thumb. And he made it as nice as he could. They got to see the plays written by these people. There was music. And of course, if you've been to Versailles, it's pretty spectacular. I mean, it was really something. Although, bear in mind, the richest people in France at that time didn't have any of the modern conveniences we have. There was no air conditioning. There was no central heat. There weren't even dry cleaners. It was a real problem cleaning those outfits they had. And those outfits were very expensive. It was all handmade, and the nobles basically felt they had to do it. Anyway, this was one of the obligations that was imposed. Basically, he imposed the obligation on the nobles of being in Versailles and on the peasants of having a 10% income tax. The English did not have that. The English were relatively free compared to the French. And there was a big difference. There was basically nothing like peasantry in 17th century England. There were not people. One of the attributes of peasantry is they still had, not all of them, but most of them still were not allowed to make contracts for themselves. They weren't allowed to own land. In fact, the term bourgeois, which means city dweller, what it was is peasants would escape from the land that they were tied to and move to the city. And then they became bourgeois. Basically, that was a way of promoting themselves in society. And it worked. It created a middle class. The cities were relatively rich compared to the countryside, because the countryside was populated by these peasants who had these horrible duties. And in addition, Louis XIV laid an income tax on top of that. But the reason the revolution happened was they needed a way to impose a tax on the nobles, because there was no other way to pay for what they had. And they had essentially bankrupted themselves in in financing the victory that we enjoyed at Yorktown. They paid for that. But they had their gunboats off of Yorktown, and the British surrendered. And that's what really bankrupted the French. It was a remarkable thing that the monarchy did that for us. And basically there were several different, the way the king went about trying to get the nobles to agree, and he wanted them to agree to an income tax. That's what he really wanted. They weren't going to be building roads, but he wanted them to be able to agree to an income tax. And how did he go about doing that? Well, there were various old groups that had existed historically in France, although they hadn't been called. There was the Assembly of, one was called the Assembly of Notables, where certain people from various classes that were notable, or however they determined who, mostly noblemen, but there could be some peasant or people from the third estate. That's what they called it with the peasantry. Some of them would qualify, people who were writers or guildsmen. Anyway, there was the Assembly of Notables, and then there was, and that's what Louis XIV wanted to call. And his financial guy, he had a special title that wouldn't mean anything in English. But anyway, he was essentially the same as the Secretary of the Treasury and head of the Fed. I mean, they didn't print money the way we do anymore. But they weren't doing that. The money was made out of gold when the king made it. But they needed an income tax because they had already had a problem with that bank where they were issuing paper money based on the value of the land in America. It went belly up, and it caused one of the great financial catastrophes of the 18th century, which our founders were well aware of, which is why they didn't want the central government ever printing paper money at all. There's nothing in the Constitution that permits it, and that's why they have that provision in there that says the only thing they're allowed to do, that the federal government's allowed to do about money, is to coin it. That's it. They're not allowed to print paper money. They're not even allowed to print paper money backed by gold. So everything the Fed is doing today under the Constitution is counterfeiting. And counterfeiting was considered so terrible that it is one of the two crimes that are specified in Article 1, Section 8, that the federal government is actually allowed to prosecute: counterfeiting and piracy on the high seas. Now here, today, every day you read about all these federal crimes that people are accused of. All of those are crimes that have just been invented and that are not permitted for the federal government to prosecute, because the Constitution is very clear. Only piracy on the high seas and counterfeiting. That's the really bad one, because that's the one that happens here. Piracy on the high seas is stuff that happens on the ocean. Counterfeiting happens here, and they did not want that. They wanted a sound currency, and they knew one way to do that was not to have an income tax and not to permit the printing of paper money. And the only paper money that was printed was all printed by banks. It was all backed by gold. That's the way it was done until the Fed was formed in 1913. For the first 150 years or so of our republic, not a dime of inflation. In fact, prices fell. Anyway, and the income tax is all involved with all of this. That's why I'm mentioning these other things in connection with talking about the income tax. Now, the Louis XIV originally the idea was to call the Assembly of Notables and have them agree, because he had to get the agreement of these people to give up their rights to not be taxed. People even bought titles of nobility to escape from taxation. It was something of real value. And that's how commoners could become noblemen. Often they were lawyers and judges. They would get titles of nobility. There was nothing like there was no legislative branch in old France. There were just the courts. They had a thing called Parliament, but it was a court. It was not a legislative branch. It could not make laws, and the only one who made laws was the king. And as Montesquieu recognized, and as James Madison, quoting Montesquieu, made explicit for our republic, no one can ever have more than one power under our Constitution and be legitimate under the Constitution. No person or group of people, like a bureaucracy. Nothing is ever allowed to have more than one power, which is why our Constitution divides all three powers. Each branch of the federal government has one power and one power alone. And there's only three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. There is no fourth branch. This whole administrative agency business, it's just not in there. And if it's not in there, it's not allowed. Anyway, Louis XVI and his financial genius, Jacques Necker, what they first did, they tried calling the Assembly of Notables to agree to an income tax. And they couldn't get them to do it. They wouldn't meet. So Jacques Necker came up with the idea of, basically it was a doomsday effort, so that, because he was going to call what's called the Estates General. And that would be like a group meeting that had the power to make deals for each one of the three estates: the nobles, the commoners, and the clergy. That's what the Estates General was. It was representatives of each estate that could make agreements to bind the whole thing. And calling this it was viewed as a doomsday threat, because if it actually happened, it could be devastating. They could literally rewrite everything in France. And that was the reason that Necker did it. He was hoping that he could have them say, oh, no, this is crazy. We're not going to let this happen, because then these peasants get the vote also. That's what happens in the Estates General. It's not just the nobles and the clergy running everything, along with the king. The peasants get to come there and vote also. And that was the way. It was a threat to try to get the nobles to agree to come in an assembly of notables and agree to an income tax. But the nobles were so stupid, they didn't get it. And they said, okay, let's have the Estates General. And that's literally how the French Revolution started. It was just a big blunder. And it was all an effort by Louis XVI and his guy, Jacques Necker, to get the nobles to agree to an income tax. That's what the whole thing was initially all about. And incidentally, at the time it was called, in 1787, Louis XVI was very popular in France. The peasants did not have any resentment against him at all at that point, or nothing to write home about. Who knew that in a few years he would lose his head? One guy did, Edmund Burke in England. He predicted that years before it happened. He saw what was going on in France. He knew that once the Estates General were called, all bets were off, because at that point you had this small body of people who had complete power in France. That's really literally what happened. And that's how the French Revolution came about. And they ended up with a collectivist mess. Anyway, that's the history of the income tax in France, at least as of that time. Now, in 1848, Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto. And in it, he's got a list of 10 things that absolutely have to happen for a country to be communist. And these are the demands he makes in there to make a country communist. One of them is to have a national bank that issues all the currency, monopoly of the currency. Another is a graduated income tax, and also to take everybody's property away, or at least to control it. What we have today in the United States is essentially 90% of what Karl Marx was demanding in the Communist Manifesto. The federal government, bit by bit, through these administrative agencies, is in complete control of every business in this country. They can't do anything without asking the federal government's permission. And there are some of these agencies, like the SEC, there are issues that they won't even issue an opinion about. They won't tell you if you're going to be in trouble if you do something, so that they have that stick. And anyway, none of those agencies are permitted under the Constitution. There's nothing in there that permits anything like the SEC or these environmentalist things. All that environmentalists do, or all these environmental laws do, they intrude on the property rights of people. Basically, they're claiming that there's a moral imperative to protect the environment, so that the people who are not the owners have a claim on the land that's actually owned by the owners. And they can do things like the Endangered Species Act, which makes people unable to use their land if some animal is there. And of course, that's used very cynically by these environmental groups. They'll find some weird animal that nobody's ever heard of and nobody cares about at all, and they'll be able to stop people from using their own land. That's absolutely antithetical to what our republic is all about. The ability to use your property is what was obtained by the nobles, taking that from King John in the Magna Carta in the 13th century. That's been part of our republic. We inherit that, and it's in our Constitution. No taking of property without due process. And these agencies, by having the ability to dictate how people use their land, they've taken the most powerful and important part of ownership, the right to control what you do with your own land and property. That's what they've done. And it's not that we would be lawless without that. We have a common law, which we also inherited from England. Anyway, in the Communist Manifesto, he said those things have to be there: a central bank and an income tax. And in 1913, somehow the people of America were tricked into ratifying the 16th Amendment, which permitted an income tax. And nobody was saying, oh, it's going to be graduated. In fact, they were all saying, oh, it's just going to tax the rich. And in a kind of way, they kind of had to do it, because at the same time they were pushing the income tax, they were pushing prohibition, under which nobody would be allowed to buy alcohol. So they were taking people's rights away, the right to buy alcohol or to sell alcohol, and they were taking they were going to have a piece of everybody's income automatically. And in that income tax law, And it was ready to go on the very day it was ratified in 1913. And you should know that practically the whole thing has been amended 100,000 times since then, but there's 2 sets of statutes in it that have never been amended. They're exactly the way they were on day one in 1913. All that employer withholding stuff and the crimes. And the way the crimes are written is the slightest deviation from perfect compliance with the income tax law becomes criminal if the person who's doing it does so willfully. And nobody knows what that means. Like things like tax evasion. Who doesn't want to evade taxes? And if you file your return 1 nanosecond after midnight on April 15th, that's the crime of failure to file is complete if you did so willfully. Anyway, those 2 statutes were in there from day one. Nobody in the country knew they were in there. They did not enforce the employer withholding stuff until 1942. It was during World War II when they thought they had drummed up enough patriotic fervor that people would go along with it and not be outraged. And the same thing with the crimes. Those crimes were in there from day one. Originally, they hardly ever used them. Very rarely. And incidentally, in the 16th Amendment, there's nothing in it that permits either that withholding or those crimes. The 16th Amendment, unlike the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, each of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment have an entire paragraph that says Congress shall pass whatever law necessary to enforce this. That's not in the 16th Amendment. So the 16th Amendment gives the federal government the right to have an income tax and to collect it. But it doesn't say anything about having any special powers to collect it. Things like putting people in jail if they don't. And there were no tax crimes in America prior to the income tax. None. And we had taxes, but there were no crimes. They couldn't put people in jail for that. In fact, during Washington's presidency, there was a rebellion. It's called the Whiskey Rebellion. People were up in arms because they had this tax about whiskey. And it was, a rebellion. None of them were prosecuted. Not a single one. Not even for sedition. There were 2 or 3 that were actually indicted for sedition, but they let them off also. But there were no crime. There was no tax crimes at that time. They were all in the income tax. And guess where they got the whole text of the income tax from? Oh, and there had been an income tax very briefly during the Civil War. During the Civil War, they did a lot of stuff that wasn't really constitutional on the Union side. All sorts of stuff. Lincoln was no saint. Anyway, they did have an income tax. They got rid of it as soon as the Civil War was over. They knew it was unconstitutional. And the Constitution was written in a very specific way to guarantee that no income tax could ever be could be constitutional. They had to ratify a 16th Amendment to get it. And they knew that. Even though the courts had been playing around with some of the words, pretending that there might be a way to make it constitutional before that, they knew that they had to have a constitutional amendment. And those 2 provisions were in there. They copied it from the income tax laws of Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. That's where they got it from. And that's what we've got today. That income tax is hideous. But they didn't have the nerve to enforce most of that stuff until well, first of all, and they didn't enforce any of the employer withholding stuff, which is how virtually all the income tax is collected now, until 1942. And bear in mind, when the employer withholds, what that is, in normal civil life in America, the only way a creditor can have your employer withhold part of your income is if it gets a judgment against you. And then, after the judgment, you have to not pay the judgment. So then they have to go to court and get another order, ordering that you get your income taken. It's called a garnishment. But that's how difficult it is in normal life for a creditor to get something like that. They get it automatically. And it's really hideous that exists. But that's what is in our income tax. And that's where we got it from. And that was all part of the progressive push in America. It really began with Teddy Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 after McKinley was shot. It was an accident. Anyway, and then, of course, the income tax and the Fed were both instituted in 1913 under the communist, there's no other word for him, Woodrow Wilson. I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you liked this video. And if you did, please tell your friends about it. And go to my website, cliffordribner.com, and my YouTube channel, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.